They called me the hymnal, not for piety, though I was devout, but because I could recite every liturgy of the machine cult from memory while my hands worked the pneumatic tools that kept our world from dying. I was proud of that name. For 23 years, I had maintained the atmospheric processors in the lower engineering decks of the Eternal Ascension, a generational arc ship of the Navis Nobilite, and I had never once questioned why the air I purified tasted of copper and ash. My name is Theron Vass, third-class atmospheric technician of the Cult Mechanicus, and I want you to understand something before I tell you how I died. I was complicit long before I became a victim. I believed the ship was our salvation. I was wrong about that. I was wrong about everything. The Eternal Ascension was not merely a vessel. It was a floating hive city, 17 kilometers from prow to stern, housing 3 billion souls who had never touched soil and never would. The ship had been sailing the void for 9 generations, its original purpose lost to time and administrative decay, its current purpose reduced to a single imperative: survive another day. We called ourselves the Voidborn, and we believed our ship was blessed by the God Emperor and the Omnissiah both. We believed the machine spirit that dwelled in its ancient heart loved us. We believed our suffering had meaning. I began each shift cycle at the tolling of the 5th bell, when the plasma drives would surge to full power and the entire lower deck would tremble with their holy thunder. The atmospheric processing station where I worked was designated Sub-Level 47, Section Kappa, a cathedral of pipes and valves where the air itself was manufactured from algae vats, recycled breath, and chemical processes I only half understood. The temperature was maintained at precisely 18 degrees. Cold enough that my breath formed clouds before the ventilation ducts drew it away to be processed again. The walls wept condensation constantly, tears of moisture that would be collected, purified, and redistributed. Nothing was wasted. Nothing could be wasted. In the void, waste was heresy. My work partner was an older man named Corvus, a 4th-class technician whose hands bore the scarification marks of 40 years' service. He had taught me the litanies when I was an apprentice, had shown me how to coax compliance from temperamental pressure gauges, had explained that the ship's machine spirit could sense hesitation in our prayers and would punish doubt with mechanical failure. Corvus believed with a fervor that bordered on ecstasy. When he spoke of the Eternal Ascension, his voice would crack with emotion. The ship was our mother, he would say. The ship was our world. To serve it was to serve the Emperor himself. I believed him. I believed all of it. Our duties were methodical, almost meditative. We would begin by checking the algae cultivation chambers, vast pools of green-black sludge that produced oxygen through sacred photosynthesis. We would test the pH levels, adjust the nutrient feeds, scrape away the dead matter that accumulated at the edges. Then we would inspect the atmospheric filters, replacing the clogged membranes with fresh ones fabricated in the manufactorum 12 decks above. We would check pressure readings, temperature gradients, flow rates. We would recite the litany of purification as we worked, our voices echoing in the vast chamber. We would log every measurement in the maintenance codices, thick books of parchment whose pages went back centuries. The work was hard, but it was meaningful. Every breath taken by 3 billion souls depended on technicians like us. When I lay in my sleep coffin at the end of my shift, muscles aching and lungs burning from the chemical fumes, I felt pride. I was keeping our world alive. I was doing the Emperor's work. The rations we received were standard for engineering personnel. 1 kilogram of protein paste per week, derived from the fungal vats and supplemented with nutrients synthesized from waste reclamation. It tasted of nothing, a gray slurry that provided exactly enough sustenance to continue working. Once a month, we would receive a small portion of corpse starch, processed from the dead in the mortuary levels. The priests taught us that this was sacred, that to consume the flesh of our predecessors was to honor their service and ensure nothing was lost to entropy. I consumed it without question. It was logical. It was necessary. The faith sermons were broadcast constantly through the Vox grills embedded in every corridor, every chamber, every crawl space of the ship. The voice of Archconfessor Maltheus, hoarse and fervent, would remind us that air was a blessing of the Emperor, that each breath was a gift we must earn through labor and devotion. He would warn us against the dangers of heretical thinking, the corruption that came from questioning the sacred order. He would lead us in prayer at the start and end of each shift cycle, and 3 billion voices would respond in unison, our devotion echoing through the metal corridors of our world. I prayed with genuine belief. When I recited the words, "The machine is immortal," in cogitation and persistence we find salvation. I felt them in my chest, felt them anchoring me to something larger than my individual existence. I was part of the ship. The ship was part of the Imperium. The Imperium was eternal. Therefore, I was eternal in my service, if not in my flesh. The Voidborn had our own customs, separate from those we imagined existed on planetary surfaces. We were taller than we should be, our bones stretched by generations of low-gravity cycling. Our skin was pale, almost translucent, having never known natural light. Our eyes were sensitive, adapted to the dim illumination of emergency lighting and the red glow of warning lumens. We moved differently than the occasional dirtside visitor. Our gait adjusted to the subtle variations in artificial gravity that plagued the older sections of the ship. We were proud of these distinctions. They marked us as chosen, as special, as the Emperor's faithful adrift in the darkness. There were superstitions, of course. We believed that certain sections of the ship were haunted by the ghosts of the dead, that the Gellar field sometimes flickered in the deep night cycles and allowed things to slip through from the warp. We believed that the ship itself could sense our devotion and would protect those who served with pure hearts. We believed that the machine spirit grew angry when maintenance schedules were neglected, that equipment failures were punishment for spiritual failings. These beliefs kept us vigilant, kept us working, kept us afraid of anything that might displease the entities we believed watched over us. I had no reason to doubt. Not then. The first anomaly appeared on a standard maintenance cycle, 34 minutes into the 8th hour, when I was calibrating the oxygen output meters in Chamber 7. The readings were inconsistent, showing output levels that should have required more algae than we actually had in cultivation. I checked the measurement 3 times, certain I had misread. The numbers did not change. We were producing approximately 14% more oxygen than our biological capacity should allow. I mentioned it to Corvus, expecting him to explain the discrepancy. He glanced at the reading, then at me, and something flickered across his face. Not confusion, but recognition. He had seen this before. "The machine spirit provides," he said, and turned back to his work. I pressed him. Where was the additional oxygen coming from? Were there cultivation chambers I did not know about? Hidden reserves? Corvus stopped working. He set down his tools with deliberate care and looked at me with an expression I could not parse. "Some questions are prayers," he said slowly, "and some questions are heresies. Learn to tell the difference." I did not understand, but I let it go. Corvus was my superior, my teacher. If he said the matter was settled, then it was settled. The machine spirit provides. That was answer enough. But the seed of doubt had been planted, small and quiet, in a space I had not known existed within my certainty. 3 days later, I found the first discrepancy in the maintenance logs. I was cross-referencing atmospheric output against population records, a routine verification required at the end of each lunar cycle. The numbers did not match. The logs showed we were producing atmosphere for 3.2 billion souls, but the most recent census, conducted just 2 months prior, listed our population at 3.0 billion. 200 million people worth of difference. I checked the census records again, thinking perhaps I had misread. I had not. I pulled the previous census, from 6 months earlier, 3.1 billion. The census before that, a year ago, 3.3 billion. Our population was declining, steadily, predictably, but the atmospheric output remained constant, as though those 200 million souls still drew breath. I sat in the archives for an hour, data slates spread before me, trying to make the numbers reconcile. Population decreased, but production did not. That made no sense from an efficiency standpoint. If we were producing excess oxygen, the cult mechanicus would have adjusted our cultivation schedules to conserve resources. We were taught that efficiency was sacred. That waste was an affront to the machine god. Yet here we were, producing atmosphere for people who no longer existed. Unless they did exist, somewhere the census did not count them. I thought of the deep decks, the abandoned sections in the aft of the ship where only servitors and maintenance crews ventured. I thought of the mutant populations, rumored to dwell in the bilge levels, the rejected and the malformed who lived beyond the light of the Emperor's grace. Perhaps the census did not include them. Perhaps that explained the discrepancy. It was a comforting rationalization. I clung to it. But then I found the third anomaly, and the comfort evaporated. I was conducting an inspection in one of the primary ventilation trunks, a massive corridor of sheet metal that carried processed air from our facility to the residential habs 12 decks above. The inspection was routine, checking for corrosion and structural fatigue. I found both, as expected in a vessel 9 generations old, but I also found something else, a sealed junction that did not appear on any schematic I had ever studied. The seal was relatively new, perhaps 10 or 15 years old, the welding mark still clean against the oxidized metal surrounding them. It had been closed deliberately, professionally, by someone who knew what they were doing. But there was no notation in the maintenance logs, no authorization code, no explanation for why a major ventilation trunk would be sealed off. I stood there in the dim red glow of the emergency lighting, feeling the vibration of air rushing past me through the intact sections of the trunk. And for the first time in my life, I felt something that might have been fear. Not of external threats, not of xenos or heretics or mechanical failure, but of my own ignorance. There were things happening aboard the Eternal Ascension that I did not understand, systems within systems that had been hidden from me despite my 23 years of faithful service. I reported the sealed junction to my supervisor, an ancient tech priest named Magos Venter, whose flesh was more machine than meat. He listened to my report with expressionless augmetic eyes, servos whirring softly in his neck as he processed the information. Then he spoke, his voice a metallic rasp synthesized through a Vox grill implanted in his throat. The seal is authorized. Your concern is noted and dismissed. Return to your duties. I asked what lay beyond the seal, why it had been closed, why it was not documented in the maintenance archives I had access to. The Magos regarded me for 3 full seconds, an eternity when measured by the processing speed of his enhanced cognition. Then, he said something that made my blood run cold. Not all of the ship's functions are documented, Technician Vass. Not all of its processes are meant to be understood by those who service them. The machine spirit has mysteries that even we, the ordained priests of the Omnissiah, can only glimpse in part. You maintain atmospheric processors. You are very good at this task. Continue to be good at it. Do not seek to understand systems beyond your purification. It was a warning, clear and unambiguous. Stop asking questions. I returned to my duties, but the doubt had taken root, spreading through my certainty like rust through metal. I began to notice other things, small inconsistencies that I had previously overlooked or dismissed. Maintenance schedules that did not align with actual equipment wear. Authorization codes that referenced departments I had never heard of. Sealed corridors, locked chambers, entire sections of the ship that existed on the schematics, but could not be accessed by normal personnel. And I noticed that whenever I asked questions about these things, I received the same response: authorized, classified, above your purification level, return to your duties. I became quiet. I stopped asking Corvus for explanations. I began to conduct my own investigations during off-shift hours, carefully, discreetly, terrified of what I might find, but unable to stop looking. I was like a man who suspects his faith is built on lies, but who cannot bear to confirm it, who probes at the wound even as he prays to find it healed. It was not healed. It was festering, and I was about to discover just how deep the rot went. The next revelation came through an accident, the kind of minor equipment failure that happened constantly aboard a ship as ancient and poorly maintained as the Eternal Ascension. A pressure valve in Chamber 9 malfunctioned during a routine inspection, and I was required to access the maintenance crawlspace to replace the faulty mechanism. The crawlspace was cramped, barely wide enough for my shoulders, and extended for nearly 50 meters through a tangle of pipes and conduits. Halfway through the crawl, my work light illuminated something I was not supposed to see: a data cable junction that had been spliced into the main atmospheric monitoring system. It was a crude modification, the kind of field expedient work that violated every protocol of the cult mechanicus, and it was connected to a secondary system whose purpose I could not immediately determine. I followed the cable with my light, tracing it through the darkness until it disappeared into a sealed conduit that led down, deeper into the ship's infrastructure. I should have reported it immediately. That was protocol. That was my duty. Instead, I disconnected one of the monitoring cables and took it with me when I completed the valve replacement. It was a small act of theft, barely noticeable, but it felt like heresy. My hands shook as I concealed the cable beneath my work robes. That night, in the privacy of my sleep coffin, I examined the cable more closely. It was standard Mechanicus manufacture, identical to thousands of others throughout the ship's systems, but the wear patterns suggested it had been installed recently, within the past year. More importantly, the data encryption was minimal, suggesting whoever had installed it did not expect it to be discovered. I had access to a basic data interface terminal in the engineering-ready room, a device used for logging maintenance reports and accessing technical specifications. During the next rest cycle, when the ready room was empty, I connected the cable to the terminal and attempted to access whatever data it had been carrying. The screen flickered and text began to scroll. Not technical specifications, not atmospheric readings, population transfer logs. I read them 3 times, unable to process what I was seeing. The logs detailed movement of personnel between different sections of the ship, but the sections referenced made no sense. Sub-level 93, that was deeper than any inhabited area I knew of. Section Omega. That designation did not appear on any schematic I had ever accessed. Processing Chamber 12 processing for what? And the numbers. Thousands of individuals transferred every month, logged with identification codes and biometric data, moved systematically from residential habs to these unknown sections. The logs went back years, an endless procession of names and numbers flowing into the darkness below. I cross-referenced several of the identification codes against the ship's general population registry. It took hours, but I found them. Most were listed as deceased, their death certificates filed with the standard causes: equipment failure, illness, old age. But their transfer dates preceded their death dates by weeks, sometimes months. They had been moved somewhere else before they died, or they had been moved somewhere and then declared dead. My mind tried to rationalize it. Perhaps there was a quarantine facility I did not know about, where the sick were isolated before they succumbed. Perhaps there was a hospice section, a place where the dying were cared for. Perhaps the census did not count them because they were already condemned. But if that were true, why hide it? Why the crude data splices, the unauthorized monitoring, the sealed ventilation trunks? Why the secrecy? I began to investigate more aggressively. abandoning caution in favor of answers. During my shifts, I made excuses to access different areas of the atmospheric system, always searching for more evidence, more pieces of the pattern. I found them. More sealed junctions, more spliced cables, more data logs showing transfers to non-existent locations. And I found something else. An access hatch in Chamber 4 that led down into the restricted sections below our facility. It was locked, but the lock was mechanical, not electronic, and I had tools. It took me 3 weeks to work up the courage to use them. The hatch opened onto a shaft that descended into darkness, emergency lighting casting blood-red pools every 10 meters. I climbed down for what felt like hours, the temperature dropping with each level, until I reached a corridor I had never seen before. The walls here were older, corroded, covered in the kind of neglect that suggested centuries rather than decades. The air tasted wrong, metallic and thick, processed but not fully purified. I followed the corridor to a set of massive blast doors, sealed and inactive. But there was a viewing port, a small circular window of armored glass, and through it I could see into the chamber beyond. It was enormous, larger than any atmospheric processing facility I had ever worked in. Banks of vat tanks stretched into the darkness, each one the size of a Chemra transport, each one filled with cloudy fluid, illuminated from below by sickly green lumens. And floating in those fluids were bodies, hundreds of them, thousands, not corpses, not quite. Their chests rose and fell with mechanical regularity, respirators forcing air into lungs that no longer functioned on their own. Their limbs twitched in response to electrical stimulation. Muscles kept functional through constant automated stress. Their eyes were open but unseeing, consciousness long since fled or suppressed. They were alive, technically, in the sense that their biological processes continued. But they were not people. Not anymore. They were meat. Processed. Maintained. Harvested. I understood then where the excess oxygen was going. These bodies, these suspended remnants of humanity, still breathed, still consumed resources, still required atmospheric maintenance. They were listed as dead in the census, but they were not dead. They were something worse than dead. They were useful. I stared through that window until my legs gave out and I collapsed against the blast doors, bile rising in my throat. The rationalization I had clung to shattered. This was not mercy. This was not medical necessity. This was industrial processing of human beings, as methodical and efficient as any other resource extraction operation aboard the ship. And I had been maintaining the atmospheric systems that kept them breathing. The implications cascaded through my mind like a pressure breach. How many of those population discrepancies represented people in those tanks? How many of the deceased I had never questioned were actually suspended in some processing facility, their biological functions maintained for purposes I could not yet comprehend? How extensive was this system? How long had it been operating? I thought of the corpse starch I consumed monthly, that sacred recycling of the dead that honored their service. I thought of the protein paste that tasted of nothing, the nutrient supplements synthesized from waste reclamation. I thought of the efficiency the cult mechanicus prized above all else, the doctrine that nothing could be wasted, that every resource must be utilized to its fullest potential. And I vomited against the blast doors until my stomach was empty and my throat burned. I do not remember climbing back up the shaft. I remember being in my sleep coffin, staring at the ceiling, my mind trying desperately to find some explanation that would restore the certainty I had lost. Perhaps they were volunteers. Perhaps they had been terminally ill, beyond saving, and had consented to have their bodies used this way. Perhaps it was mercy, a way to continue serving the Emperor even after life became impossible. But the logs had shown transfers of healthy individuals. The death certificates had listed no terminal conditions, and the sheer scale, the systematic efficiency, suggested something far more calculated than isolated acts of mercy. I needed to know more. I needed to understand the complete structure of what I had discovered. So I kept searching. I found more transfer logs, more sealed chambers, more sections of the ship that existed below the levels where normal crew were permitted. I discovered that the processing facilities extended throughout the lower decks, dozens of chambers identical to the one I had viewed, each one maintaining thousands of suspended bodies. I discovered that transfers occurred on a schedule, regular and predictable, timed to match population density in the residential habs above. And I discovered the quotas. They were buried in archived maintenance reports, casualty statistics that had been filed decades ago and never purged from the system. The quotas specified exact numbers, how many individuals were to be transferred from each habitation section per lunar cycle, broken down by age, health status, and biometric markers. The quotas were not responses to actual deaths or medical emergencies. They preceded them. They were targets, not records. The ship needed a certain amount of biological material to maintain its systems, and it took what it needed, systematically, according to predetermined schedules. The death certificates were administrative fictions, paperwork to explain the disappearances. The deceased I had never questioned had not died of natural causes or accidents. They had been harvested, and I understood, with cold horror, that this was not a recent corruption. This was not a system that had degraded over time. This had been designed into the ship's operation from the beginning, or very close to it. For 9 generations, the Void-born had been culled like livestock, our population maintained at precise levels through selective harvesting disguised as natural mortality. We were not passengers. We were resources. And every prayer I had spoken, every litany I had recited, every moment of pride I had felt in my service, had been in support of a mechanism designed to process human beings like chemical components. I confronted Corvus during a shift cycle, unable to bear the knowledge alone. We were conducting routine maintenance in Chamber 5, surrounded by the hum of atmospheric processors, and I told him everything I had discovered. The sealed junctions, the transfer logs, the bodies in the tanks below, the quotas. He listened without interrupting, his scarred hands continuing to work on the pressure gauges, as though I was discussing nothing more significant than algae cultivation rates. When I finished, he set down his tools and looked at me with an expression of profound sadness. "I know," he said. Those 2 words were worse than any confirmation I could have imagined. He knew. He had always known. And he had continued to work, continued to maintain the atmospheric systems, continued to pray to the machine spirit, and teach me the litanies of purification, all while knowing that our labor supported industrial harvesting of human beings. I demanded to know why. Why he had never told me. Why he continued to serve. Why he allowed this abomination to continue. Corvus was silent for a long time. Then he spoke, and his voice was hollow. "What would you have me do, Theron? Refuse to maintain the processors. Allow the atmospheric systems to fail. 3 billion souls breathe the air we purify. If we stop working, they all suffocate within days. Yes, there are horrors in the deep decks. Yes, people are taken, processed, used. But our refusal would not stop that. It would only kill everyone else." I asked him if the authorities knew. The arch-confessor, the Magos, the ship's command. He laughed, a bitter sound without humor. "Who do you think established the quotas? This is not corruption, Theron. This is the system. This is how the Eternal Ascension has survived for 9 generations. This is how all the fleet-based hives survive. Do you think a closed system like this can sustain 3 billion people without reclamation of every possible resource? Dead bodies are not enough. We need the dying. We need the living. We need everything." I refused to accept it. There had to be another way. We could reduce the population through birth control, instead of harvesting. We could be more efficient with existing resources. We could request aid from the Imperium. Corvus shook his head. The Imperium does not care about fleet cities like ours. We are irrelevant to them, too small to matter, too mobile to control. We have been adrift for 9 generations because no one remembers why we were sent out here, or cares enough to find out. We survive alone, Theron, and survival requires compromise. I asked him if he thought it was right. He closed his eyes. No, but I think it is necessary. And I think someone must be willing to keep the systems running, even knowing what they support. Because if people like us refuse, then people who enjoy it will take our places. Would you prefer the processors be maintained by those who feel nothing, or by those who hate what they do but do it anyway? It was not an answer. It was a rationalization. But I could see in his face that he believed it, that he had told himself this for 40 years, and that the weight of it had carved him hollow. I could not work after that conversation. I reported myself ill and retreated to my sleep coffin, my mind fractured by the impossibility of the choice Corvus had laid before me. Continue serving the system and be complicit in atrocity, or refuse and doom billions through inaction. Both choices felt like damnation. I tried to pray. I tried to recite the litanies that had always brought me comfort and certainty, but the words felt hollow in my mouth, empty invocations to gods I was no longer certain existed or cared. If the God Emperor watched over us, how could he permit this? If the Omnissiah blessed our machines, how could he sanctify mechanisms designed to process human beings? Unless the gods were not watching, unless they were watching and approved, unless the entire structure of belief I had built my life upon was a lie designed to make the unbearable bearable. I stayed in my coffin for 3 days, consuming nothing, speaking to no one, staring at the metal ceiling and feeling my faith disintegrate like corroded metal. And then I decided I needed to know more. I needed to understand not just what was happening, but why. I needed to hear someone explain to me how this could be justified, how this could be anything other than evil. I needed to confront those who made the decisions. Getting access to the administrative levels required deception. I claimed I had discovered a critical flaw in the atmospheric system that required immediate briefing with senior Mechanicus personnel. My supervisor, Magos Venter, granted me provisional authorization to ascend to level 23, where the ship's primary administrative offices were located. The upper levels of the Eternal Ascension were a different world. Here, the corridors were wide and well-maintained, the lighting clean and steady, the air pure and temperature controlled. Here, the faithful of the Administratum worked in vast halls, filled with data terminals and parchment archives, recording the minutiae of 3 billion lives with mechanical precision. Here, the priests of the Ecclesiarchy maintained gilded shrines where the upper classes could pray in comfort, their devotions unstained by the chemical reek and grinding machinery of the lower decks. I had never been to these levels before. My work had never required it. Seeing them now, seeing the comfort and cleanliness denied to those like me who maintained the systems that made this luxury possible, kindled something hot and bitter in my chest. I found the office. I sought archive management, population census division. The official in charge was a thin man named Proctor Helmond, an administratum functionary whose augmetic left eye whirred softly as it focused on me. I told him I had discovered discrepancies in the population records, inconsistencies between census data and atmospheric consumption. I told him I needed to understand how the records were compiled so I could correct for the discrepancies in my calculations. He listened with bureaucratic patience, then pulled several data slates from his archive and spread them before me. The census records deaths, he explained, his voice flat and efficient. When a citizen expires, their identification code is flagged for removal from the active registry. The atmospheric systems are then adjusted to account for the reduction in population. I asked him to show me several of the identification codes I had found in the transfer logs. He accessed them without hesitation. All were flagged as deceased, death certificates properly filed, all administrative requirements satisfied. I asked him where the bodies were processed. What happened after death? He blinked at me, confused by the question. They are delivered to the Reclamation Guild for processing. Standard procedure. All biological material is reclaimed for maximum efficiency. The body is broken down into component elements: carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, trace minerals. Some is used for fertilizer in the hydroponic bays, some for nutrient supplementation, some for chemical synthesis. Nothing is wasted. I asked if the bodies were still alive when they reached the Reclamation Guild. The question made him uncomfortable. He shifted in his seat, his augmetic eye clicking as it refocused. Define alive. When a person is declared dead, they are legally deceased. Their continued biological activity is irrelevant to their legal status. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. I asked him to clarify. How could someone be legally dead while still biologically alive? He pulled another data slate, this one containing legal codes and imperial directives. Death is defined as cessation of cognitive function to a degree that precludes recovery. Physical autonomy is not required. If an individual suffers brain damage beyond medical intervention, they are declared dead even if their body continues to function. This is standard practice throughout the Imperium. It allows for efficient reclamation of biological resources while the tissue is still viable. I asked how many people aboard the Eternal Ascension were classified this way. How many legally dead but biologically functional individuals were being maintained in the processing facilities. He accessed the records without hesitation, without any sign that the question disturbed him. Current inventory is approximately 147,000 units, maintained at optimal conditions for maximum yield. Average processing time is 8 to 14 months, depending on body mass and health status prior to acquisition. Units, not people. Units. I asked him who decided which individuals would be declared brain dead and transferred to reclamation. He looked confused again, as though the question itself was nonsensical. The medical assessment teams. They evaluate citizens who present with cognitive dysfunction, developmental abnormalities, psychological instability, or chronic illness. If recovery is deemed unlikely or resource-intensive beyond acceptable parameters, the individual is classified as deceased and transferred. It is efficient. It is necessary. It has been standard procedure for 6 generations. I asked how the medical assessment teams determined which citizens to evaluate, how they selected who would be assessed and potentially harvested. He pulled up another set of records, quotas I had already seen but had not fully understood. The population must be maintained at sustainable levels. Currently, that level is 3 billion. Natural death and reproduction are not reliable enough to maintain this balance, so active management is required. Each residential section is required to submit a specified number of individuals for medical assessment per lunar cycle. The section administrators select based on social utility metrics: productivity, health status, genetic quality, behavioral compliance. Those with lowest utility are evaluated first. The words were delivered with absolute bureaucratic detachment, as though he was describing inventory management for spare parts rather than the systematic culling of human beings based on usefulness. I asked him if he thought this was right, if he had any moral objection to what he was describing. For the first time, his composure faltered. He looked at me with something that might have been pity or contempt. Right is a philosophical concept, ideal in necessity. The Eternal Ascension has finite resources. We cannot expand our population beyond what those resources can sustain. We cannot reduce our population naturally without causing demographic collapse that would leave critical systems unmanned. Active management is the only way to maintain equilibrium. Without it, we all die. So we manage, we process, we reclaim, and we continue. I told him about the tanks I had seen, the thousands of bodies suspended in fluid, maintained in a state of barely living death. I told him I had consumed their processed flesh in my monthly rations. I told him I could not be part of this system any longer. Proctor Helmond regarded me silently for a long moment. Then he closed his data slates and stood. "Come with me. There is someone you should speak with." He led me deeper into the administrative levels, through corridors I had never seen, past guards who stood at attention before sealed doors marked with inquisitorial seals. We descended, paradoxically, moving down through levels that grew progressively more austere and secure, until we reached a chamber that felt like a vault. The walls were bare metal, the lighting was surgical white, and seated at a desk in the center of the room was an elderly woman in the robes of an inquisitorial acolyte, her face a maze of scars, her eyes augmented with targeting lenses that tracked my movement with predatory precision. Proctor Helmond bowed and left without a word. The door sealed behind him with a pneumatic hiss. The woman studied me for a full minute before speaking. "Your name is Theron Vass, third-class atmospheric technician, 23 years of service. Exemplary record until 3 weeks ago, when you began accessing restricted systems and investigating secured facilities. You have discovered the reclamation infrastructure. You find it morally objectionable. You wish to know if this is authorized, or if you have uncovered corruption you can report to higher authorities." It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the confidence of someone who knew everything about me before I had entered the room. I nodded, not trusting my voice. She continued. "I am Acolyte Severina of the Ordo Hereticus, assigned to the Eternal Ascension by the Inquisitorial Conclave 47 years ago. My purpose is to monitor compliance with Imperial doctrine and identify heretical deviation. I have overseen 11 population adjustments during my tenure. I am aware of every aspect of the ship's reclamation infrastructure, and I am the authority you seek." I asked her the question I had come to ask. Was this authorized by the Imperium? Was this standard practice? Or was this an aberration, a corruption that had taken root during our isolation? Acolyte Severina leaned back in her chair, and for the first time I saw something in her expression that might have been wariness. "You want to know if this is authorized?" The answer is yes. "You want to know if this is standard practice?" The answer is, it is standard for vessels like this one. "You want to know if it is morally defensible?" That question has no answer I can give you. "Sit down, Technician Vass. I will explain something to you that very few aboard this ship understand." I sat, my legs suddenly unable to support my weight. She pulled a data slate from her desk and activated it. Text scrolled across its surface, ancient Imperial Gothic interspersed with High Gothic liturgical phrases. "This is Administratum Directive 07 Kappa, issued 6,000 years ago during the Age of Apostasy. It addresses the management of isolated population centers with closed resource systems, fleet-based hives, generation ships, void stations cut off from regular supply. The directive is very clear in such circumstances. Population management through active culling is not only permitted but mandated. The alternative is demographic collapse followed by complete extinction." I stared at the text, unable to process what I was reading. This was not corruption. This was policy, imperial policy, codified and sanctioned at the highest levels of the administratum. Severina continued, her voice mechanical, as though she had delivered this explanation many times before. "The Eternal Ascension was launched 9 generations ago as part of an exploratory fleet. Something happened during the voyage. Warp storms, perhaps, or Xenos interference. The fleet was scattered. Communication with Terra was lost. We have been adrift ever since, unable to return, unable to find sanctuary, unable to do anything except continue sailing through the void and hoping we do not encounter something that destroys us." She paused, her augmetic eyes clicking as they refocused. "When the fleet was scattered, when it became clear we would be isolated for an indefinite period, the ship's command made a choice. They could allow the population to grow naturally, consuming resources faster than they could be recycled, leading to catastrophic systems failure within 3 generations. Or they could implement active management, quotas, processing, reclamation. They chose survival over mercy. And every generation since has made the same choice. I asked her how many ships in the scattered fleet had made this choice. How many other void cities were processing their populations like livestock? She did not hesitate. All of them. Every generation ship, every fleet-based hive that lost contact with the Imperium, every isolated population center in the void has implemented some form of population management. The methods vary. Some use controlled starvation. Some use gladiatorial combat as population control. Some use lottery systems to determine who is reclaimed. But they all cull their populations because the alternative is extinction. The only ships that refused are the ones you have never heard of, because they no longer exist. I felt something breaking inside me, some final pillar of belief that had been holding back complete dissolution. This was not an isolated horror. This was not a unique evil born of desperation and isolation. This was systematic, widespread, sanctioned by the highest authorities of the Imperium. This was how humanity survived in the void. I asked her if she believed it was right. The question seemed to age her. She closed her eyes, and when she spoke, her voice was softer, more human than it had been since I entered the room. I have asked myself that question for 47 years. I have lain awake during the night cycles, staring at the ceiling of my quarters, wrestling with it. I have reviewed the numbers. I have studied the logistics. I have examined every alternative I could conceive, and I have never found an answer that satisfies me. She opened her eyes and met my gaze. The doctrine I enforce teaches that human life is precious, that each soul is valuable to the Emperor, that we must preserve humanity against all threats. But it also teaches that survival is paramount, that the continuation of the species justifies any sacrifice, that individual mercy cannot supersede collective preservation. These doctrines contradict each other. There is no resolution. There is only the choice between 2 impossibilities, and the requirement that someone make that choice and live with the weight. I asked her if she had ever considered refusing, walking away, allowing the system to collapse rather than continuing to support it. She smiled, an expression without joy. Every day. And every day I choose to remain. Do you know why? Because if I leave, if I refuse, someone else will take my position. Someone who might not question. Someone who might enjoy the power. Someone who might expand the quotas beyond necessity into excess. I remain because I can limit the harm. I remain because my doubt is a safeguard against the cruelty that certainty permits. I remain because inaction is also a choice, and that choice leads to outcomes I cannot accept. It was the same rationalization Corvus had given me, the same logic that allowed good people to perpetuate atrocity. Remain in the system because your refusal would only replace you with someone worse. Participate in evil to prevent greater evil. Choose the smaller horror, and the terrible thing was, I could not find a flaw in the logic. If she refused, if I refused, the system would continue without us. Our moral purity would change nothing except our own complicity. We would die with clean consciences while the harvesting continued, maintained by those who felt no guilt at all. I asked her what happened to people who discovered the truth and could not accept it. People like me. She did not answer immediately. Instead, she activated another data slate and showed me a list. Names, hundreds of them. Workers, technicians, administrators, priests. All marked with the same notation, cognitive deterioration, transferred to medical assessment, processing completed. These are the people who learned what you learned and could not bear the knowledge. Some tried to sabotage the systems. Some tried to incite rebellion among the lower decks. Some simply broke, unable to reconcile their faith with their understanding. All were deemed security risks. All were processed. I stared at the list, my name adding itself in my imagination to the bottom of that terrible roll call. I asked her if that would be my fate. Severina deactivated the slate and looked at me with an expression I could not parse. That depends on the choice you make now. You have 3 options. First, you can accept what you have learned and return to your duties. You will be monitored. But if you demonstrate compliance, you will be allowed to continue your life in service. You will become like Corvus, like me, like all of us who know and serve anyway. She paused, letting the first option settle before continuing. Second, you can refuse to participate. You can resign from your position, request transfer to duties that do not directly support the reclamation infrastructure. You will be assigned to sanitation or cargo handling or some other task that keeps you away from sensitive systems. You will live, but you will be watched for the rest of your life. I asked what the third option was, though I already knew. The third option is to resist, to try to stop this, to sabotage the systems, incite rebellion, attempt to force change through action. If you choose this path, you will be declared a threat to ship security. You will be hunted, and when you are caught, you will be processed. Your body will be reclaimed for resources. Your name will be added to that list, and nothing will change because one person cannot break a system that 3 billion people depend on for survival. She leaned forward, her augmetic eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that felt physical. I am giving you this choice because you deserve honesty. Because you have served faithfully for 23 years and deserve to understand what you are choosing between. But understand this, Technician Vass, there is no good choice. There is only the choice between different kinds of damnation. Choose wisely. I sat in that cold white chamber, surrounded by the weight of 6,000 years of imperial doctrine and 9 generations of calculated atrocity, and I made my decision. I asked her one final question. If the Emperor is watching, if he is truly the God we pray to, does he approve of this? Does he sanction the harvesting of human beings for efficiency? Or are we so far from his light that he cannot see what we have become? Acolyte Severina closed her eyes, and when she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. I do not know. I have prayed for 47 years asking that question. I have received no answer. Perhaps the Emperor approves. Perhaps he grieves but accepts the necessity. Perhaps he does not watch at all, and we are alone in the void, making choices without divine guidance. I do not know, Technician. I have never known, and that uncertainty is the weight I carry every moment I draw breath. I stood. My decision was made. I thanked her for her honesty, turned, and walked toward the door. She called after me. What will you choose? I did not answer. The door sealed behind me with a pneumatic hiss. I returned to my duties. I descended back through the levels of the eternal ascension, past the clean corridors of the administrative sections, through the industrial sprawl of the middle decks, down into the chemical reek and grinding machinery of the atmospheric processing facility. I reported to Corvus that I had resolved my concerns. I recited the litany of purification with steady voice. I calibrated pressure gauges and maintained algae vats and logged my measurements in the maintenance codices exactly as I had done for 23 years. And during the night cycle, when the ship grew quiet and most of the population slept in their coffin racks, I accessed the restricted systems I had discovered and began to sabotage them. I am not a brave man. I am not a hero. I am a technician who could not bear to continue serving a system I now understood completely. So I chose the third option, knowing what it would cost me, knowing it would change nothing, doing it anyway, because the alternative was to surrender what remained of my humanity. The sabotage was subtle. I did not cause catastrophic failures that would kill innocents. I did not destroy critical systems. Instead, I introduced inefficiencies. I miscalibrated sensors so the monitoring systems would report incorrect data. I damaged seals on the processing tanks so their contents would degrade faster than expected. I corrupted database entries so the quotas would be disrupted, so the selections would be randomized instead of targeted, so the efficiency that made the horror bearable would break down into chaos. I worked alone. I told no one. Corvus suspected. I think but he said nothing, perhaps understanding that some choices cannot be shared. It took them 11 days to notice. It took them 3 more to identify me as the source. And when they came for me, I did not run. They found me in Chamber 7, conducting routine maintenance on the atmospheric processors as though nothing had changed. A squad of arbits in full riot gear, weapons drawn, surrounding me with military precision. The sergeant informed me I was under arrest for sabotage, heresy, and crimes against the imperial state. I was to be taken into custody for interrogation and processing. I set down my tools carefully. I removed my work gloves. I looked at the sergeant and told him something I had realized during those 11 days of sabotage. I am already dead. I died the moment I understood what I was serving. This is just my body catching up. They struck me then, because that is what they were trained to do when suspects spoke philosophy instead of submitting quietly. They dragged me from Chamber 7 through corridors I had walked for 23 years, past workers who averted their eyes rather than witness my arrest, up through the levels to a detention facility I had not known existed. The interrogation was professional. They wanted to know if I was working with others, if there was a conspiracy, if I was a chaos cultist or a Xeno sympathizer or something that fit into the categories they understood. I told them the truth. I was alone. I was not corrupted by external forces. I had simply learned what the ship was, and I could not serve it anymore. They did not believe me. People rarely refused to participate for moral reasons alone. They tortured me, not with sadistic enthusiasm, but with methodical efficiency, trying to break me into confessing to conspiracies that did not exist. When it became clear I had nothing more to give them, when they accepted that I was simply a technician who had broken under the weight of understanding, they sent me for medical assessment. The assessment was brief. The physician, a woman with augmetic hands and tired eyes, examined me with instruments that measured brain activity and cognitive function. She asked me several questions designed to evaluate my loyalty to the Emperor and my acceptance of imperial doctrine. I answered honestly. Knowing my honesty was condemnation, she declared me cognitively unstable, a security risk unsuitable for continued service. She signed the forms with shaking hands. She would not meet my eyes. They transferred me to the reclamation facility the same day. The processing chamber was cleaner than I had expected, clinically sterile, maintained by servitors whose human origins were barely visible beneath their augmetic modifications. They placed me in a medical cradle, restraints soft against my wrists and ankles. A tech priest explained the procedure in a monotone voice. I would be sedated. My cognitive functions suppressed to minimal levels. My body maintained in optimal condition for maximum yield. I would not feel pain. I would not experience fear. I would simply cease to exist as a conscious entity while my biological resources continued to serve the Emperor. I asked the tech priest if he believed the Emperor approved of this. He did not answer. Perhaps he did not have an answer. Perhaps the question itself was heresy. They administered the sedative. I felt it spreading through my bloodstream, felt my thoughts growing sluggish and distant. But before consciousness faded completely, before I became another unit in the processing inventory, I managed to speak one final act of defiance. I gave them my testimony. I dictated into a recording device one of the arbits had been using to document my interrogation. I spoke quickly, knowing I had only moments before the sedative rendered me incapable of speech. I told them everything I had discovered. I explained the quotas, the processing facilities, the systematic harvesting of human beings. I articulated the moral impossibility of the choice I had been given. I stated clearly that I believed the system was evil, that no amount of necessity could justify it, that the Imperium had become the very thing it claimed to fight against. And I said that I knew my testimony would change nothing, that they would delete the recording or classify it or bury it in archives no one would ever access, that my death would be meaningless in practical terms, but that I chose to die with my conscience intact, rather than live as a component of a machine I could not morally accept. The sedative took me before I could finish. Darkness rose like cold water, drowning thought, drowning self, drowning everything except a final fragment of clarity. I had made my choice. I had chosen myself over the system. I had chosen truth over survival. And that choice, meaningless as it was in the face of the vast machinery of the Imperium, was the only victory available to me. I am dead now. I have been dead for 8 months, my body suspended in nutrient fluid, my lungs breathing through mechanical intervention, my consciousness suppressed to barely perceptible levels. But some fragment of awareness remains, trapped in this diminished existence, capable of perceiving, but not affecting, of understanding but not acting. Perhaps this is the final cruelty, that the harvested are not truly dead, that somewhere in the depths of their processed minds they remain aware of what has been done to them. Or perhaps I am only dreaming this, a final synaptic spasm before complete dissolution. I do not know if my testimony survived. I do not know if anyone listened to it, or if it was deleted as predicted. I do not know if my sabotage caused any lasting disruption, or if the systems I damaged were repaired within days and the quotas resumed unchanged. I do not know if Corvus felt guilt, or if Acolyte Severina questioned her choices after witnessing mine. I know only this: I made the choice I could live with, or die with, or persist in diminished awareness with. I chose truth over complicity. I chose conscience over efficiency. I chose to be human rather than a component. And in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war and the Emperor's cold machinery of survival, that might be the closest thing to redemption any of us can achieve. I want to speak to you who may read this, you who may discover this testimony in whatever form it takes. I want you to understand what I learned in those final days before my body was processed and my consciousness was suppressed. The Imperium teaches us that humanity's survival requires any sacrifice, that individual mercy cannot supersede collective preservation, that the continuation of the species justifies every atrocity. And from a purely logical standpoint, this doctrine may be correct. The eternal ascension might not have survived 9 generations without the harvesting. The 3 billion souls who continue to breathe the air I once purified might owe their existence to the systematic processing of the weak and the inconvenient. But logic is not morality. Survival is not justification. And the fact that a choice is necessary does not make it right. I do not have answers. I do not know if there was a better way, a path that would have preserved both life and humanity. I do not know if Acolyte Severina and Corvus were correct in their choice to remain within the system and attempt to limit its excesses. I do not know if my refusal changed anything or merely added my name to the list of the processed. I know only that I could not continue once I understood that the weight of complicity was heavier than the weight of consequence, that living as myself and dying was preferable to living as what the system required and surviving. You may call this selfishness. You may call this weakness. You may be correct, but it was the only choice I could make and remain Theron Vass, atmospheric technician, believer turned heretic, complicit victim turned conscious resistor. The eternal ascension sails on through the void, its 3 billion inhabitants breathing air purified by systems I once maintained, consuming nutrients processed from bodies that once were people, praying to an emperor who may not watch and may not care. The harvesting continues. The quotas are met. The system persists because it must, because the alternative is extinction, because someone must be willing to bear the weight of impossible choices. And I am part of that system still. My body contributing its resources, my consciousness diminished, but not extinguished, suspended in the dark fluid of the processing tanks where I once watched others float in mechanical half-life. I have become what I witnessed. I have joined the 147,000 units maintained for optimal yield. But I am not complicit. Not anymore. My body serves, but my mind refused. My biological processes continue, but my conscience remains intact. I chose truth, and whatever fragment of awareness persists in this chemical darkness knows that I died as myself. In the end, perhaps that is all any of us can do. Not change the system, not save the innocent, not reform the Imperium or restore the faith we lost. Just choose, in the moment of choice, to remain human, to refuse what we cannot morally accept, even if that refusal costs us everything. The eternal ascension is a microcosm of the Imperium, entire decaying, brutal, efficient, and holy. It survives through atrocity disguised as necessity, through faith maintained by fear, through the grinding of human lives into fuel for an engine that must not stop. And it will continue long after I am fully processed, long after my testimony is forgotten, long after no one remembers that Theron Vass once questioned and chose defiance. But I will have been. I will have refused. I will have chosen conscience over continuation, humanity over survival, truth over the comfortable lies that make atrocity bearable. And if there is a God Emperor watching from his throne on Terra, if there is any divine authority that judges the choices we make in the darkness between the stars, then let this be my final prayer. I served faithfully until I understood what I was serving. I obeyed until obedience required me to surrender what made me human. I believed until belief became complicity, and then I stopped. May those who come after me have the courage to do the same. May they find ways I could not, to resist without destruction, to reform without collapse, to preserve both life and humanity. May they succeed where I failed. But if they cannot, if the system is too vast and too necessary to change, then may they at least choose, as I chose, to die as themselves rather than live as components. To retain conscience even when conscience leads to consequence. To understand that some prices are too high, even when the alternative is extinction. The void is vast and cold and indifferent. The Imperium is brutal and necessary and enduring. The eternal ascension sails on, processing its population, maintaining its equilibrium, surviving through controlled atrocity. 3 billion souls breathe, work, pray, and die in service to systems they do not understand. I understand now. And understanding, I chose refusal. And refusing, I was processed. And processed, I persist in this diminished state, aware enough to record this testimony, to speak across the distance between my former self and whatever I have become. My name is Theron Vass. I was a third-class, atmospheric technician of the cult Mechanicus. I served the eternal ascension for 23 years. I believed in the Emperor. I believed in the machine god. I believed my service had meaning. I was wrong about the meaning. But I was not wrong to search for truth. And I was not wrong to choose conscience over complicity when the truth proved unbearable. I am dead now. I have been dead since the moment I made that choice. This is only my testimony, preserved against the possibility that someone, someday, might discover it and understand that resistance, however futile, however costly, is still possible. That humanity, however diminished, however processed, can still choose. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. There is only suffering. There is only the endless grinding of human life into fuel for an empire that spans the galaxy and cares nothing for individual souls. But there is also choice. And in that choice, there is a fragment of light, a piece of humanity that the machinery cannot process, that the quotas cannot reach, that the system cannot extinguish. I chose. I refused. I died. And that, in the end, is the only victory any of us can achieve, to be ourselves, fully and completely, until the moment we cease to be at all. Let this testimony stand as my final act. Let it witness that I was, that I understood, that I chose truth even when truth led to death. Let it remind whoever finds it that the system is not inevitable, that complicity is not required, that conscience remains possible even in the depths of the void. The eternal ascension sails on. I do not. And that difference, small as it is, insignificant as it is the difference between living as a human being and existing as a component of a machine. I was Theron Vass. I served until I understood. I understood until I could not serve. I chose conscience, and conscience chose my death. May the Emperor have mercy on my soul. May those who come after have the courage to choose as I chose. And may the Imperium, someday, somehow, find a way to survive without devouring itself in the name of necessity. But I will not live to see it. I am dead now, processed and reclaimed. My body serving purposes I refuse to accept. My consciousness trapped in this final moment of testimony before complete dissolution. This is how I learned that faith without understanding is a weapon used against the faithful. This is how I learned that obedience without conscience is complicity in atrocity. This is how I learned that the true enemy is not the Xenos, or the heretic, or the void, but the system that makes monsters of us all and calls it holy. I am Theron Vass. I was void-born. I was faithful until faith became impossible. And I chose truth over survival, humanity over efficiency, conscience over the grinding machinery of the Imperium's endless war. Let this testimony stand. Let someone remember. Let someone understand that another way is possible, even if I could not find it. The darkness takes me now. I do not resist. I am already gone. But I was here, and I chose. And that choice, however futile, however small, was mine. Let that be enough.